Welcome everyone. I'd like to give you all a really warm welcome to the latest in Surviving Economic Abuse's winter webinar series, which has been generously supported by the Home Office and Comic Relief, our donors. My name's Rosa and I work for Surviving Economic Abuse. Welcome to this session today, which focuses on economic abuse and children. For the first time, the forthcoming domestic abuse bill will recognise that children experience abuse in their own right rather than only being witness to it. Although research on this subject often refers to the adverse emotional, physical and social effects of abuse, the economic impacts are often overlooked. On our webinar today, we will explore how children experience economic abuse in the context of coercive control and its long-term impacts. We have a fantastic panel of speakers today. First up, we will hear, I hope, from Dr Emma Katz, who is a senior lecturer in childhood and youth at the Liverpool Hope University. And Emma, if she's online, is going to give us an overview of coercive control and set the scene for us before moving into a focus on economic abuse and deprivation specifically. Next on, we'll hear from Dr Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, founder and chief executive of Surviving Economic Abuse, who's going to talk to us about economic abuse and how children experience it. We'll then hear from Professor Liz Kelly, who's director of the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at the London Metropolitan University, who's going to speak to us about how economic abuse is experienced by children post-separation. Then we're going to hear from Tom Mitchelson, who is a writer and actor. He's also an expert by experience and will be sharing his experience of growing up with a violent and controlling abuser and the consequences for him personally. Finally, we'll move on to some reflections on the themes and issues discussed today. Firstly, by Sarika Sheshadri, the head of research and evaluation at Women's Aid, and then Sheila Taylor, the chief executive of the NWG network, which tackles child exploitation. We'll then have an opportunity to ask our speakers some questions in a Q&A session. So please do post those in the Q&A box. And I'll introduce each of our speakers in more detail as we move through our session today. But before I hand over to our first speaker, I'd like to just say a few brief words about your well-being and about safeguarding and children in particular. So please be aware, we will be using real-life examples and case studies today. We have permission to share those, but we do ask that you do not record or screenshot these examples. Please exercise self-care and leave using the Leave Meeting button if you need a break. A recording will be available after the session. You can also message the moderator privately using the chat function, but we have disabled group chat to reduce the safeguarding risks. And there are details of support available on our website. Please do join the conversation online using the hashtag #SeeWinterWebinars. We'd love to see you there, but please also think carefully about what you share online in order to help keep people safe. So due to the topic of this webinar, we'll obviously be talking about how economic abuse impacts on children. Children never just witness domestic abuse, it always has an impact on them. The Domestic Abuse Bill, as I mentioned, will recognise that children living in a house where one partner abuses the other also experience domestic abuse in their own right. To reduce the risks of identification of vulnerable adults or children experiencing abuse, as I mentioned, we've disabled the chat function on this webinar. And we do remind all participants on the webinar today that any disclosures to surviving economic abuse which identify risks of harm to children may require a safeguarding response from us. So if you have any questions about this, you can use the chat function to contact our moderator. So without further ado, can I see whether Emma is now on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
You are, okay, fantastic, that's great. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. Dr Emma Katz is Senior Lecturer in Childhood and Youth at the Liverpool Hope University. Her research explores coercive control-based domestic abuse and its impacts on children and adult victims and survivors. Emma is an internationally acclaimed researcher, winning awards including the Wave Corinna Seath Prize, and her book Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives will be published by Oxford University Press in 2021. So Dr. Katz is going to give us an overview of coercive control to set the scene for us before moving on to talk about economic abuse and deprivation more specifically. So thanks so much, Emma, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. I need to just share my screen with you. So it says that the host has disabled participant screen sharing. Is it possible?
We do have your slides, Emma, so I can take us through those if you just say next slide.
Oh, okay. And there'll be a video to play as well.
Okay, so yeah, Becky, if when you need to do that, we'll make you the host so you can do that.
Sure. Okay. So slide. And yeah, just a reminder that, yes, hi, I'm Emma, and feel free to follow me on Twitter where I'm quite active. I'm at Dr. Emma Katz on Twitter. Slide, please. So, coercive control occurs in contexts of domestic abuse and is motivated by the perpetrator's goal of getting control of their victim's life and attempting to maintain that control permanently. That is the perpetrator's goal. And attacking somebody's financial situation is a key way of controlling them because it leaves them more dependent on the perpetrator and reduces their ability to escape, because obviously it's pretty tough to escape if you have nowhere to go and no money. Financial attacks are also a way for perpetrators to punish survivors who have managed to escape their control, because such attacks can make the survivors' new lives much more difficult. Slide. In order to tell whether somebody is experiencing coercive control, I would suggest that you need to look at the extent to which the perpetrator has limited that person's freedom, their freedom to express themselves, to stand up for themselves, to set boundaries for themselves, to see their friends and family when they choose, to do activities independently, and to just generally have a life beyond the relationship. These are things that should be in place in a healthy relationship, but will be missing from a coercively controlling one. Coercive control involves situations where there is ongoing controlling behavior, plus the ongoing credible threat that standing up for yourself will be punished. So this is basically a do what I say or else sort of situation. The punishments may take many forms. It's not always violence, but it will be something that the victim dreads. For example, it might be do what I say or else I'll upset the children, or I'll harm the family pet, or I won't speak to you for days and make you feel really bad. So whatever it is, it will be something that the perpetrator will know that the victim dreads. So the victim will try to avoid upsetting the perpetrator in order to not bring about that situation which they dread, and thus they comply with the perpetrator, which is exactly what the perpetrator wants. Slide. So yeah, exactly. That's the one. Is okay. Yeah, fine. So coercive control, in terms of how much is this perpetrated by men and women. So research by Michael Johnson and colleagues in the USA found that 22% of women had experienced coercive control from ex-husbands, and 5.4% of men had experienced coercive control from ex-wives. And research from Andy Myhill in the UK found that out of a group of women and men who'd experienced some kind of domestic abuse, something bad had happened in that relationship, 30% of women and 6% of men had experienced domestic abuse severe enough to be called coercive control. So these are rather similar figures in the US and the UK coming from these two studies, and both show that when it comes to coercive control, women are experiencing it in a much greater a lot more women are experiencing it than men are. There are a small number of male victims, but it's much smaller than the amount of female victims. And that's generally what we tend to find across the board when studies look specifically at coercive control. Next. So this is my terrible toolbox image. And if you imagine that each of the tools in this toolbox is something that the perpetrator uses in order to get control of their partner and keep that control. And so each tool is like a tactic of coercive control. So if you imagine that the hammer is the emotional and psychological abuse and the manipulation, including by sometimes being nice, which gives the victim false hope. If you imagine that the wrench is the control of time and movement and the micromanagement of everyday life. If you imagine that the screwdriver is the constant monitoring and stalking that the perpetrator does. There's also likely to be sexual coerciveness, experiences that the victim experiences as rape, and possibly some form of reproductive coercion, which is making the victim have a child that they didn't want to have in those circumstances, or making them not have a child that they did want to have. And then economic abuse, the subject that we're looking in particular at today, includes interfering with the survivor's employment, preventing them from having money, refusing to contribute to bills, and creating debt for which the victim and survivor is liable. And it's of course it's more complicated than that, but that's the sort of headline description that I've got on this slide. There will also be isolation from sources of support, including family members, friends, and sometimes also professionals. So the victim is prevented from engaging with professionals who might be able to help them. The perpetrator may engage in manipulating others, including any children in the family, in order to further upset, marginalize, and disempower the survivor, for example, by spreading rumors about them and creating false narratives that put all the blame on them. Perpetrators may use legal or institutional means to threaten, harm, or discredit the victim and survivor, which may involve things like threatening to report them to social services for being a bad parent, or threatening or dragging them through court in a vexatious way in order to wear them out and use up their money. And then I put physical violence at the bottom of this list because it's the one that tends to get particularly emphasized, perhaps even overemphasized. The perpetrator may use violence. They may not need to use a lot of violence. It may be that intimidation and threats of violence are enough to get what they want. It may not always be against a survivor themselves. It may be against their loved ones, including pets, and it may be against their property as well. Next, please. Some coercive control perpetrators use no violence at all. As Stark and Hester discuss, in perhaps as many as a third of all coercive control cases, it's the fear, the constraint on autonomy, the belittlement, and the other aspects of abuse that create entrapment without any incidents or violence actually taking place. Day and Bowen suggest that these non-violent perpetrators may actually be the most clever and skillful abusers because they have mastered more covert and hard to identify ways of abusing. Next, please. Perpetrators tend to be very charming at the beginning of the relationship, and they do this in order to suck the victim in and gain their commitment early on. They can also use nice, romantic, or contrite behavior from time to time to keep the victim locked into the relationship by giving them hope that things are better. But the fact that, quote, things are good in the relationship at the moment does not mean the abuse is over. That is in fact part of the abuse. Perpetrators can be very clever at excusing, justifying, and denying their behavior, which can be profoundly confusing to everyone else, the adult survivor, the children's survivors, friends, family members, community members. And they can present as a kind and caring person, though of course this is very deceptive. And perpetrators are often good at recruiting allies from among their family or the survivor's family, friendship groups, workplaces, and communities, and are often good at turning professionals involved with the family into their allies as well. Next. Perpetrators tend to be extremely self-centered, and often we find that they have a highly inflated sense of entitlement. Basically, they believe that their needs come first and that their partner and children should make pleasing them the priority. And it's really important to point out that coercive control is not caused by a toxic relationship, as we so often hear about it, particularly in the press. It's actually being caused by the perpetrator's deeply held belief systems, attitudes, and expectations. And these are things that they probably held before this particular relationship began. And because the problem is caused by the perpetrator's belief systems, attitudes, and expectations, the tendency to coercively control doesn't disappear when the relationship ends. It will remain within the perpetrator. Put simply, the problem is in the perpetrator, not in the relationship. Next, please. So I now want to share with you some examples of economic abuse from my own research. So I'm going to share with you quotes from mothers who discuss how economic abuse affected their children. And I think there's a couple of quotes from children themselves in there as well. So next, please. So firstly, it can harm children even before they're born and while they're nursing from their mother. As this woman described, Ria, it was a very stressful pregnancy. During the pregnancy, we were on a broken bed because he broke the bed when he threw it at me once in the night because I wouldn't wake up. After I had the baby, there was no food in the house. He would buy expensive food for himself, and I was living on water when I was breastfeeding. So here we can see that the child is being harmed, through the stress that the mother's experiencing during pregnancy, and then through the deprivation of adequate nutrition, or indeed any nutrition, while she was trying to breastfeed. Next, please. Another mum described how at the time I had no money because he was spending it all. And our daughter Jane was aware that there was a lack of money in the house for things, because when we used to go to play school, a lot of the children used to go on their scooters, and Jane really wanted this pink scooter, and it was only like £15, but I couldn't afford it. So mums, described not being able to afford, these small and relatively affordable treats for their children because there was simply no money, and then that would leave the children, feeling sort of upset and perhaps a little bit excluded as well. Socially excluded because they couldn't afford the things their peers could afford. And next. And then this is a mum and her 20-year-old son, John, who wanted to be interviewed together, and this is what they described. So they described when we would come back with shopping bags, sometimes we had to hide them. We used to throw them over the hedge into the garden so he wouldn't see them. Clothing or anything that I brought John, the son, because he'd go mad, He chose to spend his money in other ways. I had to provide the majority of things, otherwise it would have been an empty shelf. He never wanted to buy anything. His money was for his own needs, and we were very much treated as lodgers, both of us, not as his wife and child. We were treated like an inconvenience a lot of the time, other than when we were out. Then we were more like trophies showing us off. Here's my wife and here's my lovely son. But behind closed doors, he was really, really cruel. Cruelty in the highest possible way. Stopping us from going to the fridge, He was a strong man, so when he did that, we couldn't have anything to eat. So here we can see how if she bought anything, provided anything for their son, they had to hide it, they had to sneak the bags into the house. He wanted to spend his money on himself and wasn't willing to spend any of his money or money that he saw as his on providing for his child or indeed his wife. Next slide. And then Alison described how it was his constant demand for money, which sometimes left us, the children and I, with no food in the house, which was crazy because I was working. So she was working, she was bringing money in, but he was constantly demanding it back off her and then spending it. And then they were left with no food in the house. We got into a lot of debt, which after I left him took me 8 years to clear. It is only really in the last sort of year and a half where I've been able to have like a normal bank account and everything is normal. And, my credit rating is now like normal. And that's been challenging along the way. The children, accept it if I say, we just can't afford that. I've never hidden the money situation from them. So these children of Alison's, the oldest was 11 at the time. They'd grown up with this affecting the first 11 years of their life. So, you know, their mum didn't have, you know, she couldn't have a normal bank account. Her credit rating had been destroyed by all the debt which the perpetrator had got them into. So this really had a negative impact on what could be spent on them for the first 11 years of their life. Next, please. And then this is an example of post-separation poverty. So this mum described how my son Ali, who was 15, wants to go on trips with his friends tomorrow. Actually, the day I interviewed her, this trip was happening tomorrow, so it was very much on her mind. She said he wants to go on a trip with his friends tomorrow, and he's been saying so for months, and I can't afford it. And I've not got much to spend on the children, and it's hard. And then I get upset, and I think maybe if their father was with me, we would be better off. But then I can't. I couldn't cope emotionally and physically if he was here. For months, Ali's friends have been saying, Ali, come on the trip. And I say, Ali, I haven't got no money. What do you want me to do? And he says, Mum, I'm sick of making excuses to my friends about why I can't do things. He's always making excuses, always says something. But he told me it's embarrassing for me to say my mum hasn't got the money. And it upsets me. I get upset and I cry about it. And what do? I can't beg on the streets. I can't sell myself. I can't do that. So what this mum is describing is the huge emotional distress that it was causing her, that they were living in poverty. And, you know, this sense of regret of if only I could have stayed with their father, then they would have had more, but I couldn't do that because I couldn't survive it. But then she felt this guilt and upset, and the son Ali was feeling very socially excluded. He couldn't afford what his group of friends could afford. You know, he was the odd one out. He couldn't go on the trip, and it was causing a lot of friction between them, actually. And just before I arrived to interview them, they'd had a blazing row, and Ali was like shut in his bedroom, and I was actually going to interview Ali as well, but he refused to take part because of this big blazing row that they just had. So it was causing a lot of tension. And of course, it wasn't just this trip, it was all sorts of things that were coming up every day. So next slide, please. So this is a short video that a survivor recorded for me to play today. It's the last thing that I'm going to share with you today. She really wanted it shared. I think I'm going to need to be able to share this myself so I can play it and play it at the right point, because I wasn't going to play the whole thing, just a couple of minutes of it.
Okay, thanks. Becky, can you I think you've made Emma host, so you should be able to share that. I'll stop sharing now, and right. Then after that, Emma, if you could come to a close, because we're quite close to time, that'd be great. Thank you.
Of course, yeah. This is my last slide, except for a quick conclusion.
Thank you.
And I'll just play 2 minutes. So oh, let me just do that again. I'm not sure that I shared the sound. There we go.
Perpetrators of domestic abuse use the child maintenance card. In my case, he continually used it as blackmail.
Oh, sorry, that cut it off.
Economic abuse is one of the many ways he continually used it as blackmail, as a bargaining chip, as a way to assert control and fear over me. My response was always to remind him that it was child maintenance, designed for the financial security of his children, but he continued to overlook this. Out of the blue, this summer, I found out that not only he had been seeing somebody long enough to have moved in with her months ago, but she has children who now live with him. So, surprise, surprise, a form ended up coming up on my computer screen, screaming at me, "Ha ha, now I have 2 other children living with me, so I don't have to pay you so much maintenance, no." Yes, it would affect my financial situation, but indirectly it would damage his own children too. He then went on to inform me that if he made an application to the courts for a change of residency, then, by the way, you'd have to start paying me maintenance, so just think of that. The icing on the cake for me this year was after him dragging me through family court for over 2 years now, and my desperate pleas as a victim of domestic abuse and rape being ignored time and time again, my abuser became wise to being able to make an application for costs, despite his very large salary, his big house and his fancy car, versus my pitiful income, benefits and my reliance upon second-hand clothes for my children. Unbelievably, the judge agreed with my abuser, again ignoring my pleas and innocence, and now I have to pay money to the father of my children, my abuser, my rapist, for the next 3 years. The money I would have paid him over the past 3 months alone would have bought my children the Lego model they want for Christmas that I can't afford to buy them.
So to conclude, perpetrators' economic abuse harms children in multiple ways, both pre and post separation. And as we saw in that last example, perpetrators can use legal and institutional means to carry on economic abuse post separation, including through the family courts. Therefore, a greater focus on how perpetrators' economic abuse harms children is required, and there is a pressing need for robust interventions and remedies. And I just wanted to let you know that my book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, will be published in 2021. If anyone wants a copy of any of my existing publications, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to send you a copy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was a fantastic introduction to coercive control and its impacts on children. And I think those examples from your research, really illustrated those really well for everyone on the call here today. So I'm just going to share my screen again. So just bear with me a moment. I click through the slides again. Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, thanks so much, Emma. And I'm now very happy to introduce Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs. Nicola is the founder and chief executive of Surviving Economic Abuse and has worked in the violence against women and girls sector since 2006. In 2016, Nicola was made a Winston Churchill Fellow and travelled to the United States and Australia to explore innovative responses to abuse. And this led her to founding Surviving Economic Abuse, or SEE. So I'm very happy to also share that she was recently awarded an OBE for her services to survivors of domestic and economic abuse, and she's going to share with us today some more information on how children experience economic abuse. So over to you, Nicola.
Thanks, Rosa. I don't know if you can hear me. I think people can't see me. Oh, there we go. Lovely.
Yeah, I can hear you fine though.
Great, thanks, Rosa. So yeah, I am going to be talking to you today about a piece of research which I actually did back in 2008, and I've kind of really enjoyed the privilege of getting to know the research participants within that study again, the 20 women who spoke to me in great detail about their experiences of economic abuse. The research was undertaken as part of my MA in Women and Child Abuse at the Child and Women Abuse Studies unit at London Met University, and we are going to be hearing from Professor Liz Kelly, who, as Rosa said, heads up that unit very shortly. And it was part of my MA at the time, and it was really driven by the fact that I was working for a domestic abuse charity and having conversations with victims and survivors accessing domestic abuse services. And whatever we talked about, the economic impact of domestic abuse came through really clearly in those conversations. And I really looked around for information to really kind of understand this issue. But back in 2008, there was just absolutely nothing written in the UK about economic abuse at all. And so obviously the MA research was born out of that recognition, but also I think speaking to women and also talking to their children, in those domestic abuse service settings really filled me with a passion to try and do something in this space. Because I think what I recognised was that the difficulties that they were in, you know, the poverty that Emma's already described, was really preventing them from reaching their full potential. And that was what really kind of drove the passion in relation to this area. And it's something that I'm going to come back to at the end. So if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please, Rosa. And then we can probably just move on again after that one. Thank you, that's great. So whilst this was the first piece of research that had been done in the UK around economic abuse specifically, in the same year over in the United States, Professor Adrienne Adams at Michigan State University and some of her colleagues had been looking into the issue of economic abuse. So it was very nicely timed, certainly with the work that I was doing. And they had developed a definition of economic abuse, which is on the screen now. And really my research sort of aimed to build on this. And the aim was kind of twofold. So the first thing was to understand what those controlling behaviours are actually that are mentioned within the Adams et al. Definition, which you can see there. But also to understand what that threatening of economic security and potential for self-sufficiency actually looked like. So what was a lived experience in terms of impact? So those are the two things that I was looking at, the different forms of that controlling and coercive behaviour and what impact that was having both within the relationship and after leaving. So if we could just move to the next slide again. I'm sharing here the definition of economic abuse, which is included within the Domestic Abuse Bill, which, as many of you will know, is going through Parliament at the moment. And again, the reason that I'm doing that is firstly because it's very clear, having read the definition of Adams et al. On the previous slide, and therefore looking at this definition, that the Home Office definition contained within the bill really does pick up on the definition that has been used by academics. So it's talking about how economic abuse is any behaviour, again, that has a substantial and adverse effect on the victim's ability to acquire, use or maintain money or other property or obtain goods or services. And the reason that I wanted to share this, kind of beyond demonstrating the link between our understanding in academia and also how that's going to be reflected in legislation going forward, is that economic abuse is a term that we use at surviving economic abuse because we see it as differing from the term financial abuse, which a lot of you on today's webinar will probably be more familiar with. And I think this definition really demonstrates the difference between financial abuse and economic abuse. Financial abuse being about the control of money and finances, and economic abuse being broader than that in relation to the control of economic resources more broadly. So as the notes to the bill demonstrate here, property would cover items such as a mobile phone or car, and goods and services would cover, for example, utilities such as heating or items such as food or clothing. And I think Emma's presentation was really powerful, certainly in demonstrating, you know, the inability of a lot of victims and survivors to access and meet their most basic needs, and that would include food. There are lots of examples in relation to food there. So as a charity, the reason why we use the term economic abuse, and we're really keen that that was reflected within the domestic abuse statutory definition, was that it really recognises that broadness of tactics that perpetrators use. If we could just move to the next slide. Thanks, Rosa. So just to give a little bit of background in terms of the research sample, there were 55 women who took part in this research, 49 of whom said they'd experienced economic abuse, representing 89% experiencing economic abuse. And that certainly kind of sits within the ballpark figure that research across the world, in fact, demonstrates, certainly within surviving economic abuse, the prevalence that we see in terms of domestic abuse victims is roughly kind of 95%. So it sits in that area. 88% of those experiencing economic abuse had children, so really relevant to today's topic. Just to flag in terms of research participants that we had quite a good spread across representation of women in terms of ethnicity. And also that women of all ages reported experiencing economic abuse, which I think is really important. And certainly a lot of research will indicate that economic abuse and emotional abuse precedes certainly physical or sexual violence. And again, Emma talked about how, you know, you don't necessarily need to have physical or sexual violence, you know, society's general understanding of domestic abuse for it to be coercive control, but that potentially the challenge of these other controlling tactics, such as economic and emotional abuse, can then escalate to physical or sexual attacks. And certainly either the threat, as Emma talked about, you know, to animals, to children, but also to experience a physical attack once means that a victim and survivor knows that that is something that can happen. So actually that threat of what has happened before is ever present. and is a reason why a lot of victims and survivors, will not challenge that control, and very much talk about walking on eggshells, because they're always trying to avoid a situation that would be construed as control for that reason. But I also just wanted to flag that the likelihood of experiencing economic abuse did appear to increase with age. And certainly we found that the 25 to 44 age group was slightly overrepresented in this sample. It is a very small sample, so not statistically significant, but certainly all the research that I've done since in relation to economic abuse with representative samples have demonstrated the same thing. So there's something quite interesting here, because generally across the board, domestic abuse is disproportionately experienced by young women. So I think there's something about kind of economic relationships, life stages, being financially tied with someone, perhaps having a joint tenancy, a joint mortgage, having a child, which would indicate that perhaps at particular life stages, the risk of economic abuse is higher. So again, if we could just move to the next slide, please. Thanks, Rosa. Just to say the methodology I used was a combination of surveys to those 55 women. And then, as I said at the very beginning, I undertook semi-structured interviews with 20 women. And those controlling behaviours that I was looking to explore more about, as I said at the beginning again, certainly in terms of my research initially, fell into 4 different categories. You will see that there are 3 categories here. There's been a lot of research and a lot of different kind of categories that researchers have looked at. And I've actually recently just written a policy paper which explores this in more detail, which will be published in the Journal of Gender Violence in January of next year, if anyone's interested in looking at this in more detail. But certainly kind of my 4th category, I collapse into this 3rd category. So what we see is restriction, so restricting access to economic resources, be that money, access to a bank account, helping yourself to food outside of the fridge, getting in the car, and driving to see a friend or family member using your mobile phone. Exploitation, which within my research I actually called refusing to contribute. So again, one of Emma's case studies really demonstrated this, with the perpetrator having their own money, spending their own money in the way that they wanted to, but insisting that the victim kind of pay for everything else. So that might be rent, mortgage payments, food, utility bills, childcare for children, and so on and so forth. And then the 3rd category being sabotage. That might be sabotage of employment, but also sabotage of economic resources more broadly. So that might be sabotaging the family car so that it can't be driven. It might be sabotaging the credit rating because an abuser might take out a lot of debt in the victim's name to the point that they can't get credit going forward. So this is where my kind of 4th category, which I talked about as generating costs, really comes in. Because as a consequence of that sabotage, a lot of victims and survivors have to then replace the items that have been sabotaged. So if that's a family car, for example, and they still need to get to work, you can see why they would have to do that continually, perhaps if the perpetrator kept sabotaging the family car in that way. So I think it's really important, again, because a lot of people will think about economic abuse as purely about dependency, and certainly we see that in relation to restriction, but it's also about creating instability. So it may be that the victim survivor does have access to a lot of economic resources, but through the exploitation and the sabotage, there's an instability that's created, which almost has the same effect as dependency, because it just means that the economic resources that are needed to be able to make the choices that they want to going forward aren't available to them. So if we could move to the next slide again, please, Rosa. Thank you. So something else that I wanted to say was that it was clear, I think, that, and certainly at the time, we weren't calling this form of abuse economic abuse. So those behaviours weren't kind of being named as such. And I think one of the reasons for this is because what became really clear in terms of the research that I was undertaking was that they were really overlapping with and reinforcing the other controlling tactics, which again, Emma spoke to at the beginning of her presentation. And in particular, things like isolation and emotional abuse, not having access to a mobile phone, for example, not being able to phone friends and family, for example, not being able to access sanitary products when needed, created a real sense of degradation and emotional abuse. So because these things were all being experienced in lots of different ways, they weren't, economic abuse wasn't being seen as distinct, as it were. And because it was threading through all those other forms of coercive and controlling behaviour, a lot of the participants in the study talked to me about how they felt that economic abuse was constant because it was kind of constantly there, present within other forms of abuse that they were continually experiencing. And that actually the impact of that was such that, it was so ongoing, it became sort of something that really ground them down. and actually it kept them down more than in this example here, which is a quote from the survivor, a physical attack. And I suppose it's really important to make the point that without access to the economic resources and the choices that that gives people, it's one of the primary reasons why a victim or a survivor doesn't leave. So again, if we could just move to the next slide, please, Rosa. Thank you. So actually one of the outcomes of my research was that I took the power and control wheel, which is the Duluth in Minnesota, the US, developed this with survivors, where they conceptualized what the coercive controlling tactics that Emma talked about kind of look like within a wheel. And I repurposed it so that it demonstrated economic power and control. So all the segments within the power and control wheel talk about different coercive controlling tactics, and on the perimeter is that physical and sexual violence, because as we already have talked about, it's the challenge of those coercive controlling tactics which might lead to that physical and sexual attacks. And what I did was, in terms of the examples within the wheel given for each of those different coercive controlling tactics, that might be the use of threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, using children, using male privilege, etc. I gave examples of economic abuse and how they fit within those different segments. So this is certainly a model which is now sort of being used in terms of practice and really forming the basis of conversations that a lot of domestic abuse services now have with victims and survivors around economic abuse, and kind of really understanding that as part of their experience. I also just wanted to flag that there is a real overlap between economic and emotional abuse, such that, and it explains why, again, we've not used the term economic abuse, is that economic abuse has kind of traditionally been subsumed into scales which do measure emotional abuse, because the overlap is just so strong. But I think what's really clear is that obviously, there might be an overlap, but certainly the particular outcomes and impacts of economic abuse are such that they deserve a response of their own. And that's why it's really, really important to talk about them separately. And also just to flag, and it's one of the things that we're talking to government about at the moment, is that the Crime Survey for England and Wales does ask a question about financial abuse. It does ask a question about emotional abuse, but the Office for National Statistics reports on both of them together as non-physical forms of violence. So we have no kind of real national prevalence and understanding, certainly around financial abuse, and definitely not economic abuse. And what I'm going to be doing just going forward, and what I've got left of my presentation, is just focusing on that segment where children were used. So if we could just move to the next slide, please, Rosa. So some of the examples that were given within that segment then talked about how the abuser was taking the children's benefit, a child tax credit, child savings, and also birthday money. And certainly one example that always stays with me was a mother who talked about how the father on the children's birthday would run down the stairs, intercept the post, open all the children's birthday cards and take out any money or checks that were in there before the children were able to access their own birthday cards. Something really powerful which has stayed with me over the years. Again, reflecting some of Emma's work here, they were refusing to pay for nappies, milk and clothes for the children. So they were denying the children access to the economic resources they need, which therefore had impact in relation to nutrition and their ability to kind of grow up and develop. And again, I remember one of the women who kind of just said to me, I was interviewing her in her house, and she said, that armchair that you're sitting in, she was like, that was where my child spent all its life in the first days. That was the cot. It was where I changed the baby's nappy. He wouldn't give me any money. He wouldn't let me work, and I couldn't buy the things that I needed for my child. The perpetrators were also destroying children's property. So if anything was given to them, that would be destroyed, so they couldn't use it. And that included things like toys. So again, the impact on their development going forward. And they were also stealing the children's belongings. So what we found again in relation to this was that, they would search for receipts. And if they found a receipt, I think one example was a milk warmer, then they actually took the milk warmer with the receipt back to the shop, got the money and then spent the money. So there were kind of lots of very creative ways in which children were being used as part of the economic abuse. And another really powerful one was one woman who talked to me about how the perpetrator had insisted that she record the father as unknown on the child's birth certificate. And he wanted her to do that so that she could claim support as a single parent. So, clear impact in relation to a child's identity there. But certainly he then used the fact that she had done that to blackmail her. So whenever she said that she was going to leave, he said that he would report her to DWP for fraud. And obviously that was a really effective way of stopping her from leaving. Again, if we could just move to the next slide. Thanks, Rosa. So the next quote from one of the participants here, I think kind of really demonstrates how abusers also kind of played on the notion of motherhood as well as part of the economic abuse. So this was one participant talking about how she wasn't able to get money herself. If she wanted money, he would say, why don't you get a job? But if she said she was going to get a job, he'd say, well, who's going to look after the baby? It needs a mum. So these ideas about women as primary caregivers and motherhood were really played upon by the abuser. And it was kind of one of the ways, certainly, where, you know, perpetrators were saying, you know, you don't need to work anymore. Now you have a child, I'll look after the both of you. And therefore kind of using having a child as a way of introducing economic abuse. So just move to the next slide. I know I'm going to have to finish very quickly. And I just wanted to also add that mothers really felt that acutely, and they felt a great sense of kind of blame around not being able to prepare, not being able to look after their children in this way, and, you know, buy them the things that they needed and give them the opportunities they wanted in life. They kind of felt personally responsible for it, even though it was something that the abuser was doing. And so, you know, this idea that, you know, they could perhaps go without, but they didn't want their children to do so, meant a lot of them were getting into debt because they were having to borrow money or use catalogues in order to be able to feed and clothe their children. And certainly I did speak to some women who said they'd had to resort to shoplifting in order to do that. So this notion of kind of motherhood and a good and bad parent was really, really powerful. And certainly we see it reflected in a lot of domestic homicide reviews. So, for example, these behaviours are described, or the child's situation is described, but professionals don't recognise that it might be, in inverted commas, neglected because the abuser, the father, is economically depriving both their partner and the child. And unfortunately, you know, mums are often kind of held as, you know, kind of blamed for that when it's actually something outside of their control. So, you know, things like neglect, you know, properties not being in very good order, these all might be signs of economic abuse. And it's really important to kind of to pull that thread and really understand what's happening there. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide, please. I'm not going to talk to this very long because Liz is going to talk about economic abuse post-separation, and Emma has also already flagged the issue of maintenance. But just to flag that we've done a piece of research with Standard Life around child maintenance and the impact of COVID on victims and survivors' ability to access child maintenance. And unsurprisingly, perpetrators have used the context of COVID as another reason why they won't be paying maintenance post-separation. So I'm just going to move on from that now to my second to final slide, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the reason why I wanted to end on this was because we use it as a tool in training, and it's really, really powerful. Because such is that overlap between economic and emotional abuse that you can start to understand the sheer terror of what living with economic abuse is like. Because if you can't meet your most basic needs, you know, for food, water, clothing, how can you feel safe and secure? How can you feel a sense of love and belonging? What does that do in relation to your self-esteem? And therefore, going back to the very beginning of my presentation in terms of what really drives me here is how do victims and survivors achieve self-actualization? You know, how do they go on to achieve what they could have done in life if it hadn't been for the abuser? But certainly I would argue from the examples that I've given and the examples that Emma has given is that is absolutely the same for children as well. So, you know, if we don't recognise economic abuse and the impact on children, you know, we can't ensure that they are supported to you know, achieve their self potential going forward. So, you know, it's another reason why we really need to address this issue. And then very, very finally, a lot of victims and survivors, when we speak to them, if we just go to the next slide and the last slide, please, Rosa, we'll talk sometimes about, you know, this wasn't, you know, compared to other women, compared to women who've experienced physical and sexual violence, you know, it really wasn't that bad. And there's almost like a hierarchy of harm that's created. But again, what I just wanted to leave you with was this message really that, you know, there is no hierarchy of harm. We see economic abuse in every single domestic homicide review that we read as part of the quality assurance panel at the Home Office. There was no physical or sexual violence. It was, in inverted commas, only emotional and economic before the killing. And certainly a lot of victims and survivors, as I said, would have liked to have left earlier, but didn't have the economic resource to do so, might have returned because they didn't have the economic resource to look after themselves and their children going forward. And we do see more women going back because they do have children than those who don't. And ultimately, you know, this physical safety is actually underpinned by the economic stability, because if you can't remove yourself from a situation that is harmful, you're obviously going to experience more harm as a consequence of that. You know, and ultimately, of course, you know, children will lose a parent in those situations where normally post-separation, the abuser does take that ultimate act of control, which is killing their partner. So I will leave things there, and sorry for overrunning.
Okay, thank you so much, Nicola. A really, really fantastic conceptual framework that we've shared with everyone there, you know, alongside examples from your research, really illustrating why understanding economic abuse and its impact on children is so important. So I'm delighted now to introduce Professor Liz Kelly. Professor Liz Kelly is a Professor of Sexualised Violence and is also Director of the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at the London Metropolitan University. She's been active in the field of violence against women and children for 40 years and is the author of Surviving Sexual Violence and over 100 book chapters and journal articles. And in 2000, Liz was awarded a CBE in the New Year's Honours List for services to combating violence against women and children. And Liz is going to share some findings from the Cost of Freedom research related to children's economic wellbeing post-separation. So thanks very much for being here, Liz, and over to you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen, or are you going to?
I think you're going to share your screen, if that's okay.
I can't at the moment.
Ah, okay. Becky, are you able to make Liz a?
Okay, it says I'm just stopping somebody else. So.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I think, Rosa, you need to unshare your screen. Yes, you have.
Okay, so can you see this now?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, good. Okay, so thank you for the invitation, and I'm going to sort of reflect on some of the findings from this research called Finding the Costs of Freedom. And the project was to follow 100 women and their children through the process of rebuilding their lives after domestic violence. We think it's the first longitudinal study of that process in Europe. It's certainly the first in the UK. And we had 4 waves of data collection through over a period of 3 years. All of the women have been supported by Solace Women's Aid initially. And we had 65 still with us at phase 4, which is fairly remarkable in terms of retention. And Nicola actually completed the project and it fed into her awareness and concerns about economic abuse that she already had. But this project, I think, just made her aware of how foundational it was, especially that last slide that she showed, that economic stability is actually critical to physical safety. But also, as we note in this project, to freedom. And here we're echoing the work of Evan Stark, who coined or developed, he didn't coin it, apparently Linda Herman coined it many years ago, but coercive control, that our focus should not just be about safety in the context of domestic violence, but also about freedom, because so much of coercive control is about constraining the freedom of women and children to think, to do, to be. And so that's why we talked about, why we called the project Finding the Costs of Freedom. So our focus was on how you rebuild your life, but also how you remake yourself after domestic violence, to think about what enabled those things, but also what acted as a barrier to those things. And just to think about some of the processes within domestic violence, and I am going to be repeating some of the things that have already been said, but people say repeating a message is a good thing. A lot of the women in the study were very aware that pregnancy was used as a form of control, that actually they were less free in absolute terms, but also less free to think about leaving if they were pregnant, and that many of the disputes that happened that became a legitimation of men's violence and their controlling behaviour were actually disputes about household finances. Emma talked about men's entitlement. We have data going back 200 years that there are disputes in households between women and men about how the income of the household is used, and that men think of the income, especially income that they have earned, but not only income that they have earned, as theirs to decide on. And they will use some of those resources for their public life, whilst women are contesting that actually those resources should be used within the household. And one of the issues for them primarily is about children's well-being, that if children need a new pair of shoes, the money should be spent on that rather than him going down the pub. So that's an issue. And then many anxieties about children's well-being, socially and economically, being a barrier to leaving. And some women in this study actually lost relationships with children when they did leave. If there were stepchildren in the family, for example, they may lose contact with them. But we did also have a couple of women in the study whose children were actually removed. So leaving can have extreme consequences in terms of women's relationships with children. So I've called this slide Burdens and Disruptions, that post-separation, this was women's experience of the process of rebuilding their lives, that it was a series of burdens and disruptions. Many of them had to make this decision between continuing in employment or sometimes study, and the creation of stability for children. Children were often quite distressed. Many of the children in our sample had to leave the family home. They'd not been able to maintain that space and be safe. So their lives were really disrupted, and they were distressed and upset about what we call the loss of the familiar, the schools, friends, possessions, the neighbourhoods that they felt comfortable and belonged in. And women were having to try and manage those losses, and sometimes actually being there physically more for children was a decision that they made to give up other things in their lives in order to make that possible. Many perpetrators used other institutions as a form of post-separation abuse, especially the processes of divorce, contacting the family court, but also institutions like social work, reporting women to social work, and women then having their parenting examined. We had examples of what I've called the indulgent father, who would spend considerable amounts of money on children when they had contact, which made the financial limitations of mothers extremely visible and also painful for women. And it was another example of this kind of entitlement, that they would use the money for treats rather than the everyday needs of children. And the everyday needs of children are the ones that make them more visible as a child who doesn't have sufficient resources in school. The examples of the school trips that Emma talked about. And then we had many more inconsistent fathers, the ones who didn't pay maintenance, the ones who were extremely unreliable in terms of commitments that they'd made about childcare, which made planning, especially around things like employment or study, more difficult for women. We had a number of women in the study who had no recourse, and that was a huge barrier to rebuild lives. But they weren't the only women who faced destitution. We had a number of women in the study where destitution was actually the situation that they were in, which obviously has huge implications for children. So in terms of the ways that Nicola and economic abuse, surviving economic abuse have thought about this issue, there was lots of evidence of restriction and sabotage by perpetrators post-separation. And sometimes, I would say, some examples of exploitation. And we located this within a wider context. COVID is obviously our wider context now, but at the time we did this research, the wider context was one of austerity and welfare reform. And each of those things had implications for the possibility of rebuilding lives and implications specific for children. So there was very limited social housing available, especially in London, which actually meant that a number of women and children had to move several times. So this instability continued through the fact that they weren't able to become settled again. The loss of emergency payments and resettlement grants in this period. So you have to move out, you leave everything, you have nothing, and then you get relocated and you have nothing again. Many organisations had to find charitable donations for the basic equipment in a kitchen, for beds. The limitations of legal aid. If you're not entitled to legal aid, as many women are not anymore, and you have an ex-partner who is deliberately prolonging legal processes, that is draining on financial resources and has emotional consequences for children, because they have a parent who, again, their resources are being depleted by the behaviour of the perpetrator. So resettlement was actually a series of challenges and hardships for women and children, things that Emma's already talked about. And I would say that that situation has undoubtedly worsened in the 5 years since. And Nicola already talked about the cost of COVID study that's tracing the most recent ways in which these processes are happening. And we ended the study with this quote from Safe Ireland, which is looking at it from the perspective of mothers, that she more often than not comes into contact with a system that offers her more restrictions and options, more closed doors than open ones. 5 years of recession and austerity had pared down an already fragile and fragmented system of support for women and children right down to the bone. I reckon we're close to the bone now. So Nicola has already talked about this idea of walking on eggshells. So I think separation means that most of the time, women and children are no longer walking on eggshells all of the time, that they do have more freedom of thought and of social life. And I talk about this concept of space for action, that what abuse does is narrow your space for action, and that children's space for action undoubtedly increases after separation. But this isn't a straightforward or a linear process. Some women talk about their children becoming wild and them being quite angry, all the emotions that they have had to suppress whilst they're controlled can be expressed. And it's not always a comfortable place for the children or the women. So that's why we talk a little bit about rebuilding, not just rebuilding life, but rebuilding selves. And women and children sometimes need support to rebuild their own self and their selves in relation to one another. And we also concluded with saying, actually, there ought to be a national resettlement fund for women and children who have to relocate because of domestic abuse. And thinking about this seminar today, I was thinking about, should there be something earmarked within that replaces some of the things that children have lost? Because they often lose most of their possessions, their favourite toys, the things that were their emotional anchors sometimes are lost. And so I do think there's an argument to make that children should have a right to, in international human rights law, it's called reparations, that we should think that we ought to replace some of what they have lost in order to be safe. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was an amazingly deep and rich analysis of such important longitudinal findings in such a short amount of time. So thank you for that, and really helpful to also situate what we're discussing within the wider context of erosion of rights, and to look forward at the end there in terms of space for action and what we might do moving forward. So yeah, that's fantastic. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker. I'm just going to share my screen before I do that. Okay, so Liz, if I can ask you to switch your video off.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so next up we have Tom Mitchelson, who's going to be speaking with us. Tom is an actor and writer. Hi, Tom. And is also an expert by experience. In June, Tom wrote in the Telegraph for the first time about his experience of domestic abuse. So we're really grateful that today Tom is going to share his experience, talking, I think, for what is the first time publicly about what it was like growing up in a home with a violent and abusive father, and the consequences of that for him personally. So Tom, I'm going to hand over to you. Just so you know, I'm here on video like you asked, so please do take your time, and Nick's joining too, yeah, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about this today, and tell you a bit about my experience of growing up in a violent home with a controlling and unstable dad. And I think I'm going to talk just a bit about the violence to start off with, just because I think it kind of provides a context for some of the later sort of financial aspects of this. And I think it's also relevant that for a long time, until the age of 40, in fact, I didn't even speak about any of this at all. So it was quite hard to face, I guess, and the thought of kind of going back to that place or bringing it up again was just something that I couldn't really consider doing, because it was, I guess, too painful at the time. So yeah, so my dad used to hit my mum, he used to punch her, he would sometimes drag her down the street by her hair. And he would also rape her as well. So it was a very violent experience growing up. And also to the outside world, he was a kind of respectable man who could be quite charming and persuasive. And my first real memories of this was kind of waking up when I was about 6 or 7, and I would hear raised voices downstairs, and I'd go and sit at the top of the stairs, and I'd listen out until it got kind of violent, and which would be my sort of cue to go downstairs and stand in between my mum and dad to try to sort of calm it down, which quite often wasn't very successful. Sometimes the neighbours would hear the sort of shouts, and they would call the police, and then the police would come and they would arrest my dad sometimes, or they would just talk to him. And I think that but actually nothing ever really materialized from that. It would just be he would have a night in the cells, or they would have a quiet word with him. And I think that was one of the harder things, in that everything returned to normal the next day, and the neighbours just would say hello as if nothing had ever gone on. And I'm sure it would have been it's very difficult to know what to do in those situations. But I think that was one of the harder things. So I lived in a state of anxiety really as a kid. I had, I had diarrhea every day. I became highly sensitive to any sense of trouble brewing in the house. And even the moments of peace, in fact, were not really peaceful, because you were just sort of waiting for the possibility of an eruption. And we never really knew what would flick my dad's switch. So you were talking about living on eggshells, and that's a phrase that very much resonates with me. That's very much what it was like. We could be watching a film or having a conversation, and something would occur, and then my dad would be full of rage and screaming and shouting. And it was what stays with me from childhood is that shift really from sort of relative peace and calm to kind of complete turmoil, I suppose. My mum feared for her life, definitely, and it wasn't just a physical threat. She was tormented, she was pressurized, emotionally blackmailed, and I think she was sort of trapped and kind of driven half mad really by the control that he wielded. And I think if she had, if it hadn't been that case, if she wasn't under his control, she would have obviously left. That's the question people sometimes ask: why didn't she leave? Because that's the nature, I guess, of abuse. It's having someone under your control. So sometimes we would escape to a woman's refuge and be there for 2 or 3 weeks, but somehow my dad would always manage, using that control, manage to get my mum back. And due to a childhood cancer, my mum only had 1 arm, and she had 4 kids, and she had no independent money. So the only offer really at the time, this was in the 80s, was just this temporary shelter. But certainly the financial aspect of that played a big part in her ability to actually have any options at all. One occasion when we returned from the refuge, we were in the kitchen, and just been to my grandparents' house, my mum's parents. My dad, suddenly something really annoyed him, and my mum was cooking, and he swiped the saucepan with all boiling water. Potatoes went flying everywhere, and I was sort of just frozen to the spot in front of my mum. And he railed on about my grandparents being pathetic and vile, and how the present that I had received from them would have to go in the dustbin. And then later on that night, he held an axe over my mum's hand, so obviously I just want to. So that was the kind of level of violence which was quite which was very significant. And I also just remember never ever sharing any of this, because how as a kid can you? And I remember going to primary school, and the teacher sort of started to cry at some point, and the teacher said to me, what's wrong? And I just remember that moment of thinking, can I explain any of this or talk about it? And I just did not know even where to begin. So So you're sort of you're just trapped in this situation. And I think it's also a mix of fear and, yes, but shame and embarrassment, and why aren't you normal, or why don't you have a sort of normal house, and a sense that I would be betraying my dad, because obviously, you know, he wasn't just a villain. And I think that's the complicated thing. I mean, he was, but to me, he was also my dad. So it's very complicated. And I mean, it's complicated now, let alone when you're a kid. So yeah, and then we eventually left when I was 15. So it went on for a very long time. One night I heard my dad attacking my mum, but I was older by then. So I was able to go in and defend her. And that was the moment, but also that was sort of a turning point, really, and where I was able to do that. And our house was being repossessed at the time as well. So that kind of gave us a break, in fact, and that's when we managed to get out. And so when I heard about the work of surviving economic abuse, I didn't actually think it applied to my experience, because obviously the thing that sticks with you are these very violent incidences, which I've, you know, sort of outlined. And that's the thing that's in your face, the violence. But actually the control that my dad wielded very much included the control over the household economics. And my dad's erratic and volatile behavior extended very much to his relationship with money too. So he was frequently out of work because he would be fired, or he just wouldn't be able to hold down a job. And when my mum was concerned that the bills weren't being paid, she couldn't discuss it with him sensibly like other people might be able to, because there was obviously this fear that he would go ballistic, or, you know, turn violent. So she had no other option really than to make do with the money that so he would give her, when he had a job, he would give her housekeeping money, but she would also have the family allowance money as well. And so she would make sure we had food with that. But one of his requirements, and this is when we didn't have money, would be that he had a bottle of wine every night. And that was a huge part of the money that we actually had. So we would have less food simply because of that. And the other thing is he just simply didn't pay the mortgage as well. So even when he had a job, if he didn't have a job, he just wouldn't pay the mortgage. He didn't pay the bills. And affairs at the time as well. So I think a lot of the money went on that. And I think that he also picked up bar bills and bar tabs, and he paid for expensive meals out with his work colleagues. And whether he was seeking some form of sort of approval by spending sort of that money, I don't know. But he behaved like a tyrant really with that money, and the family, he spent it as he wished. And there was nothing we could do about it, nothing my mum could do about it. And the family wasn't his priority. So if she questioned it, she put herself in danger. And many times people would turn up at the door demanding payment for things. But my mum became fearful of opening the door because, one, if she tried to explain, it could be dangerous later on. But also, how would you even begin to reveal that to a stranger, and especially someone who's there saying, you know, we need money, and that's the job that they've got. So my dad started taking out loans on the house, and my mum had to be a joint signatory on some of these loans. So if she refused, which she often did, he would often just go on and on at her for day and night, keeping her up for hours and hours until she signed those papers. And she told me once how she had, I think it must have needed to be witnessed, the signatures as they went to a money lender's office, and she was barely speaking, had her head down to the ground and signed it. And obviously the person there would have known something was going on, but again, if he had spoken out, what would have been the consequences later on? And obviously he had his business was lending money. So as a kid growing up, with that kind of instabilities, the financial instability of it, you got used to not having money, not being able to afford football boots, so not being able to join the local team. School trips was mentioned earlier, and you know, that was another thing that kind of really separated me from my peers at the time. Our phone was cut off. But the thing I felt at that time was always embarrassment and shame about it, because you just don't want to tell your friends that you've got no money or what's going on at home. And because my mum kept everything a secret, I think as a kid you don't really understand, so you just sort of fall into the same pattern and do the same thing. So I just pretended everything was fine all the time, and it was a huge act to keep up that pretense. And then so later on in life, I always told myself you don't sort of dwell on things, and you don't, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Other people have far worse problems, so why go on about your own? But I think it was only when my dad died and I had my own son around the same time that I was sort of released from this spell. Suddenly thought about my own son, and what if he had seen some of the things and had the behaviour done to him that had been that I had seen. Well, then it would have sort of broken my heart, and that's how I was able to really sort of put it in some sort of context, and then begin to understand it, and also see the effect that it actually had on me, because I used to think it had had no effect at all. So I became a very I think as an adult, I was a very ultra defensive person. I had trouble trusting people. I had a feeling in my life that everything might explode any given moment. Made me very edgy. I lived in a sort of permanent state of readiness, which is a very tiring thing to do. I had a strange relationship with the truth and secrecy. I mean, my whole life had been a secret, so I sort of carried that on really into my adult life. And I think one of the most significant things was that what I was then able to do is look back and see how vulnerable that had made me. I never thought of myself as vulnerable, but when I thought about myself as a child, I could see that. And unfortunately, one of the things that happened was that I was abused by a teacher at my secondary school. And I also kept this a secret. Yeah, so when I faced up to these things, I was able to see how that sort of instability at home had kind of paved the way, and my vulnerability had paved the way for this teacher to do these things. And one of the things he did, which I now understand was grooming, was to offer the sort of care and friendship that perhaps I was looking for, or a father figure. But one of the key things, and one of how I think he sort of laid the groundwork really to his abuse, was financial. We didn't have any money, so we didn't have a car, so he would give me lifts everywhere, and it was incredibly useful back at that time. He used to pay for things that would have been treats. So like we didn't really afford to go to the cinema, so he took me to the cinema. And you know, helped me at school. He bought me books for school that I couldn't afford. So he very much used that lack of money and the control that my father had over money as a way of paving the way to get what he wanted, which was to abuse me in some way. And actually now he's been banned from teaching many years later for what he did. So that's a good thing. But the more I've discussed, and you know, mentioned that I've written about this, the more I've discussed what happened to me, and the more I've written about it, I've been very sort of understood that it's incredibly widespread. So people have written to me off the back of my article. And I think the big thing is, one, I just sort of realized there are so many people with a similar experience or something else going on. But really, you never have, the reason I've sort of told you about all the experience, you never really have an idea what is going on behind closed doors. And I think that's really important to remember. And also, when victims of this, like I was, or my mum was, are too frightened or too ashamed or too embarrassed to talk about it, it's even more important, I guess, for people outside of that to understand that these things are very real and are happening every day in all over the world, and they need help and they need people to understand. But I think that's about it for me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing your story with us all here. I'm very grateful for you for doing that, you know, and the generosity to share your experience of, you know, how such extreme violence and control, you know, has an impact on children's lives. And I think that so many of what you've described here speaks to the themes and experiences that our other presenters have talked about through their research, you know, and really, you know, I think it's very brave of you, and we really appreciate how much you've shared with us today.
Thanks.
So thank you so much. Nick, did you want to add anything?
I will do, just hugely powerful, and thanks to Tom. I think he's really brought this to life in a way that people will understand and relate to. You know, and ultimately we would hope, you know, as Tom said at the end, you know, it changes practice, and rather than expect people to reach out, we start leaning in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to our next speaker. I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay, so next up, I'd like to give a really warm welcome to Sarika Shashadri, who's the Head of Research and Evaluation at Women's Aid Federation of England, where she oversees the organisation's research and data collection, supporting a national evidence base on what works for survivors. This includes producing flagship annual reports and in-depth research in collaboration with a range of academics and partners across the sector, and including on monitoring the ongoing impact of COVID-19. So I'm going to ask Sarika if I can ask you to join us and share some reflections on the presentations we've heard today, perhaps linking back to your own research with children or any common themes you've observed today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the speakers today, I think, for such powerful and insightful presentations, especially Tom. And I really agree that it's just so important to have that insight. And I think what you've shared will have such an impact. I'm just going to bring up some notes, if you bear with me 1 second. I think what's obviously really clear from these presentations is that economic abuse in the context of coercive control affects children in their own right in such a multitude of ways, and for such a long time, you know, including post-separation. And I think what's also clear is the really critical role that professionals and statutory services and all of us in the community, how important it is for us to really understand economic abuse and coercive control and those dynamics. Another theme that kind of stood out for me was resistance, and how clear it is that children are not just passive victims, but they're also constantly having to negotiate and manage and resist the abuse in different ways, and that obviously came out really powerfully in the presentations. I had also prepared to speak a little bit about the importance of the relationships between the non-abusive family members, and again I think it just came out so powerfully in those presentations. You know, how critical those relationships are between, you know, the mother and children, but also siblings and extended non-abusive family members, So for example, grandparents who so often are such an important source of support, including financial support, and those family members will go to great lengths to support and protect each other and find comfort in that. But also how difficult that is, you know, when perpetrators have actively sought to undermine those relationships, and the strain of that, in addition to the strain of poverty itself. And you know, I thought about some examples of that from our work, but I think that the examples that have been shared today are really powerful. And you can just see how far-reaching the impact of that economic abuse is. It goes far beyond sort of the immediate economic resources of the children, but the relationships and the long-term impact of that. And if domestic abuse, you know, limits adults' space for action, it certainly does for children as well. You know, as Liz and the other speakers spoke about, limits their potential and their choices, and particularly, you know, we know that the impact of poverty on children is so significant, and poverty in childhood can have, you know, long-term impacts that are irreversible. You know, for example, deprivation of nutrition, but also emotional development. So these are themes that are also really clear in our work and our members' work with survivors and the research that we've done with children. So we recently published a report looking at children and young people's journeys into refuge. And this was part of our No Woman Turned Away project, which provides dedicated support to women who face barriers and structural inequalities in accessing a refuge space. And one of the clear themes that emerged from this was the economic struggles that these children and young people experienced. And they told us about the great lengths that their mothers went to protect them from hardship. But obviously the themes of financial difficulties and the lack of adequate food and clothing featured heavily in their accounts. They also talked a lot about the loss of the familiar that Liz mentioned. And you know, one participant spoke about how difficult it was to live on just £20 a week, and she spoke about how they hadn't been able to afford a present on her birthday, but her mum had told her she would get one later, and when they did, it was obvious that she chose one that was the cheapest one, which brings me back to how you know, children and young people are constantly managing the impact of economic abuse. So I was asked to reflect a little bit on some calls for action following today's presentations, and we are at the moment calling for a number of urgent policy measures. Firstly, we're calling for the Domestic Abuse Bill to amend the Children's Act to explicitly name coercive control as harm to children. So we're really pleased that the forthcoming bill will ensure that children are recognised as victims of domestic abuse in their own right. And coercive control has obviously been criminalised for a number of years now, and we support SEA's proposed amendment to ensure that this extends to post-separation abuse. But we're also calling for an amendment to the bill to ensure that the Children's Act names coercive control as harm to children. Unfortunately, in our No Woman Turned Away report, we found that out of the women who were fleeing with children who were supported by the project and who had contacted social services, a third had had negative experiences with them, including 8 cases of refusal to accommodate children and mothers. And at the same time, the participants in the study, like we've heard today, talked about how the difference it made when they did have a positive interaction with professionals. So it is really critical that the Children's Act adequately meets the needs of these children. We also know that the Department for Education is currently planning to update the Working Together to Safeguard Children statutory guidance to reflect changes in the bill. And we want to ensure that this is used as a real opportunity to make sure that professionals really understand the impact of coercive control on children and know how to respond safely. Critically, we need to ensure that funding for specialist support for children is inbuilt into future sustainable funding for specialist domestic abuse and violence against women and girls services by default, and not as an optional add-on. We know that there is a shortage in refuge provision for families with children, which is occurring within a context of a more general shortage in bed spaces, and only a third of refuges are able to employ a dedicated children and young people's worker. We estimate that we need 393 million annually for specialist domestic abuse services, including 173 million to ensure that the national network of refuge services is sustainable and can meet the needs of survivors and their children. And this must be delivered alongside ring-fenced funding for specialist services led by and for Black and minoritized women, deaf and disabled survivors, and LGBT+ survivors. In our No Woman Turned Away research, we've also seen how many families fleeing domestic abuse face additional barriers and structural inequalities. And as Liz mentioned, one of the key issues is no recourse to public funds. Of those women who were supported by the No Woman Turned Away project this year, who had at least one child, only 5 out of 33 were accommodated in a refuge. So it is really critical that we ensure full and equal protection and support for migrant survivors in the forthcoming bill. The final point that I would just like to mention is that it's also important to note that support is available for teenagers who experience abuse in their own romantic relationships as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really helpful reflections, helping us to see themes across what we've heard today, but also taking us into a forward-looking space where we're talking about calls for action and support that's available to others. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And we're going to move on to another set of reflections, please, from Sheila Taylor. Let's move on to the next slide. Sheila, if you're online, if you can join us now. So Sheila began her interest in community work in the early 1980s, and in 1998 was made aware of children being sexually abused through exploitation, and began working to support young people identified. And this work led to the development of Safe and Sound Derby, where her work there was pivotal to the success of Operation Retriever. She founded the NWG network tackling child sexual exploitation, which supports over 14,000 practitioners to disseminate information on child exploitation to over 300 organisations across the UK. So Sheila, if I can ask you to help us link what you've heard today here to the issue of child sexual exploitation and any reflections you'd like to share with us.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's been incredibly interesting listening to everybody. And we've just begun to work with Nicola, who just for information, was formerly a trustee to the NWG network a few years ago. And there's such an overlap with our work that it's been, I have such a lot to say and 10 minutes to say it. So I'll kind of bullet point it. The very first thing I want to say is thank you, Tom, for very eloquently sharing your experience to help us all understand what we can do to reduce the impact. It was very brave of you and obviously really hard to share with so many. Inspirational, you were inspirational, and I'm sure your mum would be very, very proud of you now. I just wanted to pull out some of the similarities in the coercive control. So coercive control is a main feature in the exploitation of children, controlling their lives to perform criminal and sexual acts with the threat of harm, exposure, shame, humiliation, fear, threats to parents and siblings, all to make them conform. We've heard that all the way through today's presentations. That isolation from friends and family and professionals, isolating in children from professionals as well. And I know in a grassroots survey that we did with health professionals, a sexual health nurse talked about young people that were sexually exploited being told by their perpetrators to keep their phone on while they were on a call, to call the perpetrator before they went in, to keep the phone on while they were actually in the clinic. And how much of a control is that to make sure that they don't disclose anything? That criminal exploitation of children often involves them creating debts with those people who are exploiting them as well. That makes it hard for them to remove themselves. We've heard it in the presentations. Perpetrators are often charming and romantic to start with, and that leads to grooming, and they're very clever at excusing and justifying behaviour. So many parallel behaviours there. That creating a dependency on is key as well. The levels of violence Tom talked about is also held over the children being groomed. And I know that in my past experience, a very young girl, slightly built, was held by her ankles from the 3rd floor of a building outside of the window because she wouldn't do what she was asked to do, and that obviously that threat lived with her forever and made her very compliant. And then we moved on to the impact of children. So what does this mean for the children? Well, coercive controlled behaviour in the household means it becomes quite normalised, and that makes it so much easier for groomers to build on that normalised, this is how things work. I think Tom's experience was probably he was much more aware that it wasn't wrong, but in many cases the control isn't seen as wrong, and it does make it easier for groomers. Controlling money and a lot of not allowing the buying of essentials or items children would help that separates them from friends, heightens the ability for a child to bring money into the household, particularly at the moment around county lines, and that sense of responsibility to provide and contribute to ease the burden on the affected parent leads again to the vulnerability to be groomed and exploited. Children are often exposed to domestic violence, are dismissed in the family court in favour of a contact culture, leaving the adult victim and the child at risk of further harm. I was really pleased to see Maslow's hierarchy of need. That's something we refer to when we're talking about the holistic needs of a child, looking at everything that they need to reduce those vulnerabilities, because increased vulnerabilities is that increased risk at being exploited. And in many cases, the children believe the perpetrator is a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So loyalty and dependency becomes an issue for us when working with those young people. It's very difficult to get them to see that it's a controlling relationship rather than a loving relationship. And that balance of the change of direction from a perpetrator, from being nice to being aggressive and anger, and quite young children, just, you know, these children are exploited from 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, not being able to cope with that, not being able to have any ability to talk about that with other people. And of course, the children, when being controlled, are at serious risk of being sexually harmed, repeatedly raped, assaulted, and in some cases it leads to death. Some separation of parents, that's interesting, isn't it? We're talking about a whole thing about creating vulnerabilities in our children, and that separation of parents and the impact of that, economic impact in that. So you might have lost a significant income, you might have to move areas, and Liz was talking about schools, families, possessions, neighbourhoods changing. all of those things contribute to, they are adverse childhood experiences, and we know from research and people who work in the trauma-informed world talk about 3 adverse childhood experiences increasing the vulnerabilities of a child. And I can see those ACEs just all the way through all of those presentations. The physical and mental impact that increases vulnerability was clearly an issue around there. And Tom so bravely talked about how that paved the way to exploit him through grooming with kindness, treats, and that help with finances, just making it so easy for the offender to take what he wanted. And of course, poverty and deprivation are definitely contributing factors to vulnerabilities. Multiple ACEs always increase vulnerabilities to the risk of children being groomed and exploited, and economic abuse, it was just coming through all the time. And looking at all of this, and I spoke to Nicola the other day about a piece of work we're doing. The online increase of online sexual offending during lockdown has escalated, and the first figures, 8.8 million downloads in April alone of indecent images, resulting in arrests where one parent gets arrested. That affects the income in that household. It changes living accommodations, sexual stigmas, and all sorts of things, and therefore increasing those ACEs and that vulnerability of each child. I think it's been an incredibly important day, and I thank you for allowing us to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, there for walking us through some really important reflections around those parallels between child sexual exploitation and economic abuse, and the complexity of those, but how they really weave through those experiences and shape children's vulnerability in particular. And I agree, it's been an absolutely fantastic session. I'm so pleased to hear from everyone today. Really rich diversity of reflections. We haven't got much time left now, so I know we're not going to be able to get through many questions in the Q&A now, but I thought we probably got time for maybe one, or maybe we could squeeze in two if we keep our answers short. I probably won't be able to come to all of the speakers for a question, I'm afraid, but one of the questions that we have got online is around what support is available to mothers who may be subject to these forms of economic abuse. And I wondered if Nick, I could come to you first on that question.
It's that space, isn't it, between desperately trying to find your mute go button, which seems to take an age. I would say there is more support, certainly now. Historically, domestic abuse services have always done an amazing job in supporting victims and survivors across their range of needs, although again, as Sarika's reflection shared, that resource in order to do that, to the ability that we would want to, is really important. So to echo her calls to action around support, and similarly Liz's in relation to that that fund for victims and survivors. But I would certainly say also through our work, increasingly there are other spaces. So, issues around repossession that Tom talked to, debt, again, that Emma spoke about, are all things now that a lot of financial institutions are responding to via a code of practice introduced by UK Finance back in October 2018 So there's a lot of information via our other webinars, which have been recorded on our website. And I know, Rosie, you're going to speak to a specific resource that we have around economic abuse and children on what mothers can do. So I would just also encourage people to check out the resources section on our website.
Thank you, Nick. So I think we've got time for maybe just one more quick question. So we also had a question online around, and this is to Liz, in terms of your findings around the loss of the familiar, and whether there were any particular findings or whether that was particularly an issue for migrant women. So I wondered, Liz, if you could just briefly reflect on that question, please.
It's hard to say that there's one pattern in any of this. Everything is so contextual. But I think that there were certainly specific and enhanced fears for recently migrated women, sometimes to do with their immigration status, sometimes to do with threats that are made in relation to children, and certainly having one of the things that they certainly lack, perhaps more so than other women, is knowledge of how systems work here and what their entitlements might be. So there's a knowledge and a rights gap, because actually sometimes they don't have the same rights as British women, women who have citizenship here. So there's a huge need, I would say, for particular services, and we have very important by and for services here, services run by minoritised women for minoritised women, where they have a particular expertise around issues around immigration rights and welfare rights when you yourself are a migrant. But all services, I think, need to have that as one of the components of the work that they do and the knowledge that their workers hold.
Thanks, Liz. That's really helpful. I think what we've agreed we're going to do is, because we haven't got time for everybody's questions today, we will get back to people on those later, if you'd like to get in touch with those. And I'm just going to, before I close, thank you so much to all our speakers today for such insightful and powerful reflections, and we really appreciate everyone joining today, sharing the vital work you're all doing, raising awareness of economic abuse in children, and particular thanks to Tom, our expert from experience, for sharing his story here today. So I'm going to talk us through just a few other ways that you can get involved in the work that we've heard about today. So there's lots of ways that you can get involved with surviving economic abuse and learn more. Please do explore our website, where we have lots of resources, including a fantastic resource which we've developed in partnership with Family Action. That has lots of advice there on supporting children. So you can access that resource alongside many others on our website, and the link is here for you. We also run training on a range of issues relating to economic abuse with a range of stakeholders. So please do get in touch if you want to find out more about the training that we can run for you or in partnership. Just reach out via the website or the information there. We also, as I mentioned, this is part of a series of webinars, including this one. They're all available on our website, the recordings of those, and please stay tuned for more information on our final one, which will be on the rapid review of our COVID-19 findings in the new year. We're also excited to share with you, we're on a mission, as many of you will know, to clock up 20 million sea steps between now and the end of March. We're walking virtually from the UK to Australia, where the seed of sea was first planted. And the walk first started as a way to bring the team together, but now we're providing an opportunity for everyone to join in and help raise awareness of our mission. So please do join us on that journey. If you'd like to sign up, there'll be details of that to follow. And finally, there's lots of ways that you can keep in touch with us. Details are on our website, including where you can sign up to our newsletter, or if you need any support on any of the issues that we have spoken about today. So just for me to say thank you so much again to all of our speakers, and to everyone who's been listening here today and joining us. We really hope you enjoyed the webinar, yeah, please do keep in touch, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.